Welcome to the Experimental Honesty podcast. I'm Brian Curtis. Today I'm speaking with Dr. T. Ryan Byerly. Ryan's a senior lecturer in the Department of Philosophy at the University of Sheffield in England. His research focuses on virtues that regard the well-being of other people, which includes intellectual transparency, intellectual dependability, identification with all humanity, in addition to other topics. His most recent book is Intellectual Dependability, a virtue theory of the epistemic and educational ideal that was published back in 2021. I met Ryan back in August of 2022 at the initial research conference for the Honesty Project, and I was really interested in his work on intellectual transparency, which we'll focus on during our conversation today. And you can learn more about Ryan and his work by going to his website at tryanbyerly.weebly. That's Weebly, tryanbyerly.weebly.com. And as a side note, the Experimental Honesty app is now officially released. So if you're interested in living a more honest and open, authentic life, through guided practice of the most effective skills that span clinical psychology and the science of honesty, head over to experimentalhonesty.com and you can start your free 2-week trial of the app. And so I know it's been a long time, and it's very exciting that the app's finally out there for you to check out. All right, let's talk to Ryan. So let me get I'll attempt an introduction for you, and we'll see how I do. Okay. So I'm here with Dr. T. Ryan Byerly. By the way, what is the T for?
T is for Timothy.
Timothy. All right, cool. So, Ryan, you're a senior lecturer in the Department of Philosophy at the University of Sheffield there in England. And your research, focuses really broadly on these virtues that kind of regard the well-being of other people, right? It's not just about the individual, it's about others. And this includes things like intellectual transparency that we'll be talking about today, also intellectual dependability, identification with all humanity, other topics as well, right? And your most recent book is Intellectual Dependability, a virtue theory of the epistemic and educational ideal. And that was published back in 2021, right? How did I do? Is that all right?
That's great.
Anything I left out that you're like, no, there's this about me?
No, not really.
All right. So number one, I'm super excited to talk to you. We met in person at the Honesty Project, that initial research conference back, that was in August, I think, of last year, right?
Yeah.
And so with folks that are doing the kind of research you're doing, I'm usually pretty curious to hear about kind of the path that led you to where you are. And with you, you're also across the pond too in the UK. And so, however you want to take this, what was, when you think back, the kind of path that led you from where you started to where you are now, researching the stuff that you're researching and, interested in the stuff you're interested in?
Sure. Yeah. Thanks for asking.
Yeah.
Yeah. So when it comes to the work that I've done on other regarding intellectual virtues like intellectual transparency, what led me to become interested in this topic was I was still back on the other side of the pond, maybe around 2013 or so, and I was often asked to teach courses in logic and critical thinking. And in the US, these are pretty common courses, tend to get a good number of students signed up that might be required sometimes. And there's a bit of a question about what else to include in these courses besides an introduction to formal logic. What else goes beside that? What else do you include? And a way that I wanted to do it was to introduce students to both skills in reasoning that they would get with an introduction to formal logic, but also to introduce them to intellectual virtues that are these kind of features of personal character that have to do with how we approach investigating topics and engaging in inquiry as with other people in a community.
Mm-hmm.
And at the time when I was teaching these courses, there wasn't a book that brought both of those topics together. And so I managed to secure a book contract to work on that. I thought I would continue working at the same kind of place where I was at the time for many years in the future. That turned out not to be the case, but yeah, I secured that book contract, and then I had to face the question of which intellectual virtues to talk about in the book. And as I thought about that, it seemed to me like I'd like to introduce students both to intellectual virtues that might seem to manifest in their own individual pursuit of the truth, like being intellectually courageous, or being intellectually careful, but also intellectual virtues that might be involved when they're depending on other people, like being charitable to people that they're interpreting, trying to avoid biases in who they listen to, and then also virtues, these more other regarding virtues that have to do with sharing, roughly sharing information. So caring about other people's acquisition of knowledge and understanding, being a clear communicator, and being able to represent their perspective faithfully to others. That's kind of how I got my start, actually, in thinking about those virtues. And it wasn't for several years afterward that I began to work on the topic more, in a more rigorous academic vein, really.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and so I mean, that was interesting when I was, kind of reading some of your work, this notion of an other regarding virtue. I had to kind of explore that difference among like the other virtues, but it really is there's something about wanting other people to have, in this case, maybe like the information you have, something about how you communicate it to them. And it seems like foundationally to kind of promote their own well-being, like this would benefit them, and that's actually the intention, something that you want for them, right?
Yeah, that's right. So, I mean, in a way, you might think, well, aren't all virtues going to be other regarding? You might start out thinking that way. It might be in particular with the virtues that we call the intellectual virtues, where you begin to think, oh, well, maybe not. So, and as it turns out, and I didn't really know this when I was working on the logic book that
Mm-hmm.
we started out talking about. It turns out that there's been a good deal of work by philosophers on particular specific intellectual virtues, but the vast majority of that work, even till now, focuses on what I would call self-regarding intellectual virtues. And that doesn't mean they're selfish. It's just
Mm-hmm.
that they're focused on acquiring goods for the person that has the virtue. So specifically, they're focused on helping that person gain true beliefs or gain knowledge or gain deeper understanding, virtues that promote that. And when I talk about other regarding intellectual virtues, they're also virtues that have to do with the process of inquiry, trying to gain understanding, but they're focused on helping others to gain those intellectual goods of gaining true beliefs or gaining a deeper understanding of things.
Yeah. And so before I guess we move forward, if let's say taking intellectual transparency, right? And you've done a lot of work here to develop, this account of intellectual transparency. Would you mind just taking a second? I think you already hit on some of the little main points here, but just really to get crystal clear on when you think about that and all the time and effort you've put into this, how do you either define it or how are you currently thinking about what intellectual transparency is?
Yeah. So I think of this as a tendency to share your perspective faithfully with other people in an effort to help them gain better understanding or knowledge or true beliefs. So you're motivated by a concern for their intellectual well-being, and you recognize that you might be able to help them improve their their understanding of things by sharing some aspect of your own perspective. There might be many different aspects that could be relevant. It could even be things like asking questions or sharing what's unclear to you. Or it could just be that you know something that's relevant to what they're trying to figure out. You just communicate what you know. Something that's relevant to what they're trying to figure out. You just communicate what you know. So you have a good grasp of your own perspective on things, and you're also able to communicate that well to the other person. And you're willing to do it because you care and want them to have a better understanding of things.
Yeah, and that point there, it was interesting how this seems to be there's a lot of skills that can go
Mm.
into this virtue, right? And one of these skills that came up in the kind of reading that we might talk about is the skill of kind of self-knowledge, right? So to know enough about ourselves, to know, well, what we do know, what we don't know, and in you thinking about this, and how do you view in terms of self-knowledge, like how people would go about developing that, how that applies to something like intellectual transparency? I mean, as a clinical psychologist, we focus a lot on tools and skills and practices, but things like, self knowledge, and also how this influences things like self disclosure, what we actually are willing to share with people. We can go wherever we want with it, but yeah, I guess your thoughts on the nature of the skills here, and I guess this requirement for self knowledge here.
Yeah, thanks. Thanks for asking about that. Yeah, I do think of intellectual transparency as requiring both skills that enable the person to have a good grasp of what their perspective is. So these are skills of self-knowledge, as well as skills of self-disclosure, of helping them to communicate their perspective well to others once they've got a handle on what the perspective is. Um, I think I think in some ways I want to punt to someone like you for help when
Uh-huh.
it comes to what are the skills that help someone to have a good grasp of their perspective. I think this is a topic that I know less about, that in terms of the empirical work that we've done so far on intellectual transparency, it's not something that we've been able to investigate. To investigate rigorously what helps people to gain a better understanding of their perspective. I have a few things I could share. I mean,
Hmm.
one idea that comes to mind is just, you know, well, what you're gaining a grasp of is a perspective. And so there's certain things that you could just learn about the nature of perspectives themselves that could be helpful for this process of better understanding your own perspective.
Hmm.
And so thinking through the different kinds of elements that might be involved. So when I talk about a perspective, I mean for these to be understanding perspectives as things that can be quite richly complex. They could
Right.
include your specific beliefs, but also like arguments that you have for views, intuitions that you have, experiences that you've had that have informed your thinking, your own sort of intellectual tendencies and proclivities. Um, so the questions you might have, sort of unclarities. So all of these are sort of
Yeah.
aspects that might be involved in a perspective. And so one step to better understanding your own perspective is to realize how complex these can be, and the different kinds of elements that are involved, and then to have to think through and try to distinguish. Sometimes it might not be obvious to you whether you uh, believe some view is false or whether you just don't believe it. Those
Right.
are different, they're actually different attitudes, and being able to kind of distinguish those and really try to make some sense of what your perspective on things is. I think that can be somewhat helpful, but it's not an easy thing. So it might seem to us like, well, of course we know, we just sort of, that comes for free. It's easy to know what your perspective is. You know that automatically, but we're not fully transparent to ourselves, even with a lot of work and with a lot of skill. Um,
Yeah.
yeah, it can be difficult to understand well what our perspectives are.
Yeah, and this, I mean, a lot of when you were talking, the things that started coming to mind is, I mean, these foundational either practices or just ways to go about being more aware of, well, what do I believe? What do I actually value? And so a lot of, I mean, when this comes up in, let's say, clinical work with people, when you start exploring things that are actually meaningful to them, like if I ask somebody like, well, what do you actually care about? Or why would you do that? Why is that worthwhile? Or why does that matter for the life you want to live? A lot of the times we get this just deer in the headlights look of, oh, I've never really thought about that. Right. And so really exploring, well, maybe they do value honesty. Okay. They value imparting something accurately to another person. They do value something like intellectual transparency, but they also might value things like being kind to other people or not hurting their feelings. And so Emma Levine's stuff with, benevolence and honesty, that kind of conflict there. And so that can be one thing of self exploration, like what actually matters to you. But then you can also do what I think you're talking about as well, as not just getting more information on a topic. Let's say your friend brings something up about politics or about whatever thing it is, and you can become more and more aware about how little you might know. This happens to me all the time. The more I learn, I'm like, oh, I really don't understand a lot about this. And so maybe that's intellectual humility, or you can identify different errors in like how you're thinking, like, wow, I tend to be really extreme. I'm pretty all or nothing. There's not a lot of nuance to my position. And so getting more flexible, being able to admit when maybe we don't know, that's really hard to do, right? Instead of just, BSing all the time that we do know. And so this is kind of the tip of the iceberg, but these are some kind of core practices of just recognizing, I guess, a deeper maybe awareness of how much we do know. I guess another aspect would be our intentions or our motivations here for sharing whatever we're sharing. And that might go to something like self-disclosure. But so I'll pause there. I'm curious, how is all this sounding to your philosophical ears, knowing a lot more about this topic than I do?
Yeah, no, that sounds exactly right. And yeah, and it also, as I was listening to you, I'm just thinking as well that being able to not just know those things about yourself, but also being able to share those things too with another person. They can be relevant for the other person. They can make a difference. If the other person has a better understanding of why you're communicating what you're communicating, that may make a big difference for them receiving that communication. If they know something about you that, well, I'm the kind of person I tend to be more extreme in my views, so let me just kind of put that on the table, and that can help the other person to, better incorporate what you're communicating to them.
Yeah.
And I mean, really, that's what I'm after when I'm talking about intellectual transparency, is making your perspective sort of open and available for the other person for their benefit. They can get a better understanding of where you're coming from, how you're thinking through things, so that in some way that might benefit them.
Yeah, absolutely. And I guess what was coming up for me too is when we, because this is about conversation and communicating things clearly. And a big distinction that can be, it's been helpful in my life and I think other people's, is this difference between, well, what might be what we could consider a fact, right? This is maybe empirically true, versus what are kind of based on more of our opinions and our beliefs, right? And so that can be a big deal too, about, well, this feels a certain way to me, versus when we take a step back and we're like, well, what is the data supporting this? And so part of intellectual transparency, it seems like it would be this ability to understand where you're getting your information, how this impacts you and your learning history, all the things about biases and our assumptions versus facts. Like you're saying, it can sound like, oh yeah, I like to communicate honestly and transparently with people, but this is super, super complex, right?
Right, and it can be very difficult for us to recognize why we've come to think the way that we have on some topic. I mean, you might just not be able to go back and figure out, was it because I was convinced by some argument? Was there some data that publicly available data that convinced me about this, or was there some deeper kind of motive that may have moved me, you may not always be able to uncover that.
Yeah, for sure. And there's a lot you make, and to me, it really interested me, just this notion of the relationship between being a person who either values intellectual transparency or like an intellectually transparent person, the impact of this on our relationships. Right. And some of the work that you've done, both empirically and reading about it. Yeah, let's maybe talk a bit about just how this approach of, this desire to communicate something accurately, to promote people's understanding, either we could maybe start with what, you've found while writing and doing your scholarly work. And we can also talk about just our own experiences about our relationships and how this tends to impact that stuff. But yeah, I'm going to stop talking intellectual transparency relationships. I'm going to throw that over to you.
Sure. Yeah. One way that I thought that intellectual. So I think that as a virtue, just like any other virtue, I tend to think intellectual transparency will be valuable for its own sake. That it's good to possess a virtue like this because it just makes you a better person, regardless of how it might be related to other outcomes. But I also think it might be conducive to promoting other valuable outcomes. And one of those is that it may promote better quality relationships, close personal relationships like friendships and romantic relationships in particular. And one pathway whereby I would think that it would do that is by putting the person that possesses it in a better position to disclose themselves well to close others. So one thing that we know about close relationships is that one of the things that people often cite about what they think makes a relationship close to begin with is that the parties in the relationship disclose themselves to the other. They really get to know the other person extremely well. And so it would seem like intellectual transparency would be the kind of quality that would enable you to do that well, to really help the partner to come to understand you well. You're willing to share yourself, kind of make yourself available for them to know, right? So that's most of those comments, I guess, were mainly conceptual in nature, but we do find some support for this empirically too. I guess the best evidence that I have for this at the moment is work I'm doing kind of in progress.
Mm-hmm.
So that what I've asked, so I've recruited participants who are willing, who are part of a romantic relationship with each other, and they're both willing to participate in a survey, and have each of them sort of report on their own. They use a scale that we developed for measuring intellectual transparency. And then their partner will respond to questions about how satisfied they are with the relationship, how much they like their partner, how committed they are to the relationship. And so we're finding that when one person in the relationship scores higher on our measure of intellectual transparency, the other person reports greater satisfaction with the relationship. They report that they make decisions with the other person in a more mutual kind of way.
Mm-hmm.
They like their partner more. So in this, intellectual transparency seems to be contributing uniquely beyond even other features, even like honesty or love of learning or big five personality traits. So it seems to be making a unique contribution there to these relationship outcomes.
Yeah, that was something I was interested when, I guess, at the honesty conference, when it was like, I think, intellectual transparency. I forget your title, but it was a fun one. Like, honesty at its best, I think, was what it was,
Right.
right? Yeah, and so for me, I was really interested because I know when you look at those semi-partial correlations, it's separable. Like, there's something added that intellectual transparency is giving outside of honesty per se. And so as you've continued to think about this, I know for me, I'm still curious, how do you view what might be unique or separable with something like intellectual transparency with something that seems like it has a lot of overlap, but clearly it's not the whole deal. How are you thinking about the differences between something like honesty and intellectual transparency?
Yeah, that's a great question. I do agree. There's a lot of overlap, and I mean, in some ways, I don't know if I don't know if you or your listeners, if you would have come across the term, like intellectual transparency before. I mean, there's some truth to just saying like, oh, I kind of made that up. Like, I mean, basically, I was driven by what I saw as a theoretical gap. So we talked about intellectual dependability, a book that I wrote about this topic earlier, that a gap that I saw is, well, it does seem like we need to be able to fulfill this role of being uh, the kind of person that other people can depend on when they're trying to figure things out. And so I just was trying to think about the kinds of virtues we need that person to possess. What kinds of
Yeah.
qualities does the person that we want to depend on when we're trying to figure things out need to have? And one of them that seemed clear to me was this trait that I ended up calling intellectual transparency.
Yeah.
I'm not very fussy about the name, by the way. If people think there's a better word for it, I'm very happy to take suggestions. But yeah, I do. It does overlap with honesty. Honesty also has to do with sharing, communicating truths, being willing to resist temptations to speak falsely, to misrepresent your perspective. So they overlap in those ways, and likewise, honesty, both conceptually and empirically, seems to be important for personal relationships, like we were talking about.
Yeah.
But I do think that the way that I've defined intellectual transparency and the way we've developed a way of measuring it, they do come apart from the way that honesty is more typically defined, and also common measures of honesty. They come apart in somewhat subtle ways. I could highlight a few of these. So, for instance, intellectual transparency seems to require sort of more positive effort in communicating. So, some of the best accounts of honesty that I know of are derived from Christian Miller's work. Christian was organizing the conference where we met.
Yeah.
He defines honesty as a tendency to avoid distorting the facts, roughly. And there, that definition, honesty is about avoiding doing certain things. Whereas intellectual transparency, I'm defining this in terms of sharing, something that you do. So there's kind of a stronger, more positive element involved. Other potential differences, you might think, one way of thinking about honesty is that it focuses on avoiding speaking false, communicating falsehoods, making false statements, right? If you think of honesty in that way, as focused on the statements that are made, then there's another difference between honesty and intellectual transparency. Intellectual transparency is actually more concerned with the ultimate effects on the person you're communicating to. You're focused on improving their perspective, helping them understand things better. Sometimes saying something false might actually improve their understanding more. That might sound a little confusing, or like I'm advocating some kind of Machiavellianism or something, but I'm not actually. I'm even thinking about kind of mundane cases like science communication, where some false theory is incredibly useful and helps people have a better understanding of how the world works, even though it's not itself literally true. So you might think there's another difference between them. We talked earlier about skills. It's not as clear whether honesty, is it more just sort of avoiding knowingly misleading people, or does it require these kinds of skills of knowing, accessing your perspective and being able to communicate it well to the other person? That might also be another difference. So these are somewhat subtle differences, but they are recognizable conceptually, and they seem to make an empirical difference too.
Yeah, and I think just hearing you say that was kind of my intuition. I didn't have an intuition when I first, met you, and because that was a new term to me, but the more and more I learned about that, I'm like, oh, I think for me, what you just said about, well, this is really focused on communicating it for the well-being of other people, making sure you're clear, understanding, self-knowledge, self-disclosure. And so you, Ryan, you could be super honest, but you might not have that prompting to, let's say, go on a podcast. Right? I mean, like what you're doing right now, I guess what we're both doing is we're trying to communicate something hopefully clearly, right? In a way that I'm assuming here, but we would both hope would be beneficial for other people, right? So that added component of doing something for really for the benefit, maybe for ourselves too, but that focus on the other person and honing those skills when we don't get it right or we identify a gap. That to me was the clear, like, oh, I hadn't heard that in the stuff about honesty, dishonesty. And so I guess to be continued about what falls out with the empirical stuff. But your description, that was my intuition of, oh, this is kind of the new piece, is this desire to foster the understanding in other people, and how that to me was not surprising that that would be super deepening to these intimate relationships. And yeah, so that's just to say that that totally makes sense in terms of how I've been thinking about this too, just reading your work.
Sure.
Right.
Yeah, that's great to hear. It's sort of confirming for me a bit. I appreciate that.
Cool. And you did mention, so I diverted us a bit talking about the separation there of intellectual transparency and honesty. But so during the work you did with couples, right? You bring them in, they fill out relationship questionnaires and measures of intellectual transparency. That was one thing I was curious about. So your work with, it's Megan Haggard, right?
Mhm.
And
Yes.
you both developed this self report measure of intellectual transparency. I know I get interested when measures come out about, like, well, that's an interesting process to think about how we ask about this thing. And so you don't have to go through, I think it's you boil it down to like 6 questions, is that right?
That's
Okay.
right.
Yeah, you don't have to share all of them here, but I'm just curious. I know for me and maybe some listeners would be interested, like what would be these questions that we would kind of gauge ourselves and how intellectually transparent we might be?
Sure. Yeah, I'm happy to share some of this with you. So I'm not sure how many items we started out with, maybe in the neighborhood of 50 or 60 sort
Mm.
of initial items. And yeah, ended up boiling it down to just 6. And we were trying in the writing of the original item pool to be, covering all the bases conceptually of what's involved in intellectual transparency. And it turned out that these 6 items were highly predictive of how people will respond to the other items in the pool. And they kind of fall into two factors, or two sort of categories.
Mm-hmm.
One is focused more on the person's motivation to promote the other person's understanding by sharing their perspective with that person. So here, example items include: I like to contribute to others' learning by sharing what I know with them. And it makes me happy to improve another person's thinking by sharing my own thoughts with them. And the other factor is more focused on kind of the skill that we talked about of having a good grasp of your own perspective. So some example items here are: I'm good at figuring out why I think the way I do.
Hmm.
And I can sometimes catch myself before I make an intellectual mistake.
Yeah, that's interesting. So as you were saying that, I was just thinking, like, I bet I would have answered that differently when I was younger. And so, I mean, hopefully this would track like objectively if they are good at that. But I guess it would be this more subjective sense about, I've thought about it enough to know when these errors might exist. And not only is this something I might be prone to do to communicate, my beliefs to other people, but it's interesting. It makes me happy to do so,
Right.
right? Like this is a positive aspect of my experience.
Right. Yeah. So you're motivated to do this, and your affective tendencies sort of line up with this too. You take some joy in in helping other people to gain a deeper understanding.
Yeah. And I mean, this just, I mean, so clearly, I guess, in your profession, and as I was hearing those items, I mean, some of the aspects I enjoy so much about my clinical work and being able to introduce people to these concepts, and I mean, basically just tools that it always blows my mind and usually their mind, that like, why didn't we teach these things in school? So things like being able to recognize a thought as a thought, right? What emotions are we experiencing? Can we actually name them? These foundational things about our experience. And but so being able to communicate that to somebody within a framework, and then to maybe see somebody have that aha moment, like the light bulb goes off and they
Mm.
get something they didn't used to. Just as you were saying that, I haven't really thought about that as clearly about, oh yeah, that really is one aspect that I know I love. And when I think back on, in college, in grad school, like the professors who were just lit up, and I could tell like, oh yeah, they really enjoy this. They're not just up there doing it. So I guess this speaks to when you mentioned, I guess, more in the occupational domain. So it wouldn't be surprising that people like teachers and
Mhm.
professors would really be kind of prone to having this. And so yeah, I don't know how much there is to say about that, but just reflecting, like, oh yeah, that is it. It feels good to do that, and I guess it's because my motivation isn't to be like, I'm the expert here and I'm teaching you something, but it's this more joy of communicating something that's understood. Does that make sense?
Yeah, absolutely. I
Yeah.
think there's a lot of truth in that for many of us that are involved in some way in teaching or mentoring. That it can be that kind of moment that you were describing, where the person who may be learning something from you really gets it and has the aha moment and the joy that you take in that. Yeah, it can be kind of what keeps some of us going in the work that we do. Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah, I have been. I mean, I haven't had a chance, yeah, I haven't done it yet to look specifically empirically, at teachers, but that's kind of been my suspicion too, is that, that might be a profession where you find people will be particularly high in these kinds of traits, or where these traits might be particularly important for, success in the workplace.
Hmm.
Yeah, I have thought that, sometimes people will describe the intellectual virtues as a group as the virtues of the good learner, and I tend to think that the group of virtues that I call the virtues of intellectual dependability, you might characterize those as virtues of the good teacher. Yeah.
Hmm. And I guess that would make sense, right? We're learning, it's for us, it's for insight, but when it's those other regarding stuff, it's, can we then, yeah, that's right. Can we then communicate this effectively to other people for their well-being, right?
Yeah. The only sort of caution that I would sort of, um, well, raise about that is that I want these traits to also capture the way in which we can really contribute to our, um, that help our peers,
Hmm.
or even people that know more than us on a topic. So this happens a lot in my profession, where having an outside perspective on things can be really helpful. So someone comes to my talk and they say, "Oh, I don't know anything about the topic that you've just been talking about, but let me ask this question." And it's always like the best question, right?
Hmm.
Oh yeah, I really need to think more about that. That the way that they're sharing their perspective there, it ends up
Hmm.
being incredibly helpful to me. And it's not that they have some kind of greater expertise than me on that topic, but uh, they're they're just sharing that perspective, help me to come to understand things better. So we can do this even for our peers, or people that even know more than us about a topic.
Yeah, absolutely. And I guess part of this might be separable, but things like curiosity, openness, right? And this kind of willingness to entertain new perspectives too, right? We don't see that as threatening. They're not. And again, I think this could come back to intention, right? Like, why, if we're open and we want to learn more, and then we want to turn around and teach it to other people. Yeah, that's really interesting. I like that too. That's why I like talking to people from different disciplines as well. Coming from like initially neuroscience and then going into more psychology, like I get that. But when I talk to now philosophers like you and Emma and Christian, it's, oh, that's a whole other level here. And then people who are into more, spiritual, contemplative, meditative traditions, like, oh, that's even more about awareness and all this stuff. And so, but again, that then opens the floodgates to knowing how much I don't know. And it's been this evolving process of this used to be, and this is, I guess, going into my own personal experience with this stuff. I used to have a very, it was almost threatening. Like I needed to put on this mask of knowing more than I did know. But eventually, like the ability to be able to honestly admit when I didn't know, and then ultimately to kind of enjoy that because I can actually be this true lifelong learner. But you still want to do due diligence. You want to think like you would prepare a little bit to know something, but being okay not knowing. I don't know how, like, what's coming up for you as I say that, but I've really noticed that trajectory in myself of, oh, there's so much and I actually don't know it. And I guess maybe that's intellectual honesty versus transparency, but just being able to admit when, you know what, I'm not sure, I'll look into it, or that's a great point, right?
Right. Yeah, I mean, in a way, I think it can be related to a kind of barrier to sharing your perspective. If you have a, you know, if you're strongly motivated to give an impression of that you're highly knowledgeable and you want to protect that impression, then that can be one thing that could lead you to be very careful about sharing certain aspects of your perspective, like raising questions or admitting that you don't seem to understand something that's been talked about. This yeah I think I mean I yeah in some ways I can sympathize with that kind of experience. I think it comes up sometimes in academia. It's related to what's the term for this? It slipped my mind.
We'll find it together.
Yes,
What's
let's
it?
find it together. Yes, I'm admitting my ignorance here. This very very common experience that we have of feeling that imposter syndrome is what
There you
I'm
go.
thinking
Yeah.
of. Yeah, so
Absolutely.
that kind of feeling, that feeling that you're out of place, you're worried, you don't, you're going to come across as being so ignorant. That can be a barrier to sharing your perspective.
Yeah. I've never felt imposter syndrome. No, I'm just kidding. Yeah, like that's that was, but that right there, what you're describing, there's something about, in this case, self-disclosure that, in my personal life, I found that willingness to take the first step, and whether the word is admit, but just to be open about either our own lack of knowledge in one domain, or maybe that we made a mistake, or just that we're struggling. I know for me, opening up about like my struggles with like anxiety and perfectionism, also doing work with, sleep disorders, my 21-year history with chronic insomnia. Like when folks hear about this, it's like, oh, we're actually human and we're all kind of dealing with this together. It's not, there's something wrong with me. Like being able to not just communicate that, but I guess a willingness to self-disclose something that maybe people would avoid because they would be worried about how that's going to come across. I know in my own life there's this, the pros and cons here, right? You can definitely, let's say, overshare the TMI thing, right? Like,
Right.
is this, and that's why am I actually talking? Like, why am I communicating this? It's super important as a clinical psychologist. Like, self-disclosure is this almost taboo topic with people on both sides. You should be a blank screen, like it's just about the client, or yeah, you should just be totally open. But if you're just talking about, I know somebody who, like, they saw a therapist and they said the therapist just talked about their grandkids for a session. Like, why? And so that would be self-disclosure for sure. They want to communicate something, but I guess this speaks to, like, is that useful? is it helpful and what is the intention to do that?
Mhm.
So I know there's kind of a lot there, but in my own experience, it's been powerful about the nuance of self-disclosure and I guess the role of intention of why we're even talking in the first place, right?
Yes. Yes. Yeah, I have some, yeah, this comes up in a kind of funny way for me in, my personal life, my, romantic relationship with my partner,
Mhm.
that, yeah, I'm usually on the side of experiencing where I've got the temptation to share, and it's not necessary.
Right.
Yeah, because, like, we'll face some decision that we have to make, and we go about thinking about making the decision in such totally different ways. So I'm the one who will I have to think through all the details and all of the possible decisions that can be made and all the ramifications of those, and have to sort of suss through all of those details before I can, and if I even end up getting to a decision. And my partner just takes it all in, and then she's got the answer. And so, I may sometimes experience the temptation, but what about this? And what about, I want to raise all of
Mhm.
these issues. They're part of my perspective on things, but I need to, sometimes it's really not going to be helpful for me to bring this up. She's highly reliable,
Mhm.
she
Yeah.
like, she's really good at this. She's sort of applying expertise, really.
Mhm.
And just she's got it. And on her side, the thing that she's sort of learned to do is to communicate to me a particular aspect of her perspective on things when that happens, which is that, hey Ryan, this is one of those times when I'm using my expertise and it's just clear to me what the answer is, and I don't have
Mhm.
to have an answer to all of the issues that you're wondering about. And that actually can be helpful to me. I realize, oh yes, right, okay, I should just trust her uh,
Mhm.
on this topic.
And I mean, that is more self-knowledge, right? What you just said is, "Hey, I have this tendency. Like, I tend to think it
Exactly.
through. I do this way." And we meet other people, your partner in this case, who they have this different tendency. And you're now learning from that, like, oh yeah, that can be super, helpful in this situation. And that can then further our insight about our own tendencies and whether that's helpful moving forward. And I guess there's what you kind of mentioned too as well. It's not very helpful, right? Helpful and useful for me, at least, it's well, we need to know where we're going, right? Like, what is the goal here? What is the point? And in your case, like, if it's just about making a decision for where to go to dinner or, you know what I mean, whatever it is, what is the most effective way to get us from here to where we need to go? And I guess being able just to be open about, well, I want to think through these 12 possibilities, and your partner just says, no, let's just we'll do this. And it sounds like that's okay for you, right? But
Yeah.
you know this about yourself.
Yeah, yeah. Well, I mean, so, and I'm thinking about cases where I'll end up agreeing.
Right?
Like I'll end up, it's just going to take me 20 more steps, and then I'll finally get there. So I've come to learn that
Yeah.
well, she's just already there. She's just a number of steps ahead of me, and I'm just slowing us both up if I insist on working through all these details.
Yeah. And I mean, we've talked a lot about this being almost all positive, right? Being intellectually transparent, being open. And I guess it as I'm asking or thinking about this question, this is another difference with honesty, is there's a lot to make about our intention with why we're being honest. So, benevolence versus this, like brutal honesty. Why are we actually doing it? But it sounds like with how you've defined intellectual transparency, it almost would be almost a net positive because we want people to understand this, and I guess for their own well-being. But I know one thing you put, like, you wrote down is, well, what if there's infidelity, right? Like, what if you want somebody to know something that might be destructive to the relationship? I'm kind of, as I'm talking, are there downsides? Are there warnings about more and more intellectual transparency as there might be with honesty? Or I don't know if you've thought a lot about, I guess, the dark side of intellectual transparency.
Yeah, yeah, it's a good question. I mean, in a way, I think you're kind of getting hitting this with what you're saying. In a way, tried to define this in a way where it sort of hits the mean, where you're not going to be involved in sort of pointless oversharing, something like that. That
Mm-hmm.
it's regulated by a motivation to promote the other person's genuine understanding. Really will be helpful to do this. Yeah. So I do try to contrast intellectual transparency with vices
Mm-hmm.
on both sides. So, uh, it, I mean, I guess a lot of it does kind of come down to motivation. So, someone who's highly motivated to share their perspective because they want to show everyone what a wonderful perspective they have, right? So, so that would be a different, a different trait, not intellectual transparency as I'm understanding it. Might overlap with it. Maybe they might share skills. They'll both have some motivation to communicate their perspective. They're doing it for quite different reasons, and that will affect their behavior too. Different sort of scenarios where they will choose to communicate more or less. It's a little harder to try to like pin down. It's supposed to be if
Right.
if
Yeah.
I've done my job well,
Yeah.
it's supposed to be harder to pin down the dark side of intellectual transparency itself. I suppose though that, I mean, like, just like any other supposed virtue, uh, living virtuously can come with risks to your
Mm-hmm.
own well-being. So here, in this case, you're caring genuinely about the other person's acquiring knowledge and understanding, and there are times when to act that way can come at a risk for you, and there's a reason why people, choose not to say share knowledge at work. This is a major
Right.
problem that apparently costs over $30 billion a year, and for Fortune 500 companies, people withholding knowledge, but they have certain motivations for doing that.
Mm-hmm.
Well, if I share this knowledge and my colleague gets a hold of it, then they'll advance further than me in the company, and my career might be at stake. So there may be some downsides in that respect, that anytime you're showing genuine concern for others, maybe putting some trust in others, you expose yourself, make yourself somewhat vulnerable.
Yeah, and I guess that would be a lot of discernment about, well, what is the context? And again, just more and more self-knowledge here about why would I be sharing this? And yeah, that was a really interesting example in the workplace. And I don't know if it's worsened. I think you might have mentioned like since either the pandemic or just recently, like stingy is the word. Like we want to hold on to information. This is powerful. We have it. If my colleagues knew this, they could have an advantage. We're downsizing, and therefore I don't want people to get a leg up. And so it's very, as I'm talking about this, it's kind of a winner take all. It's it's not a win-win type of a situation. So I guess in those scenarios, what I'm getting is this isn't just a blanket positive. There will be times potentially where, this may not be the most useful course of action moving forward. The workplace may be one of those examples, right? I know in my own field, if one of the, deception is pretty much universally, I don't know about universally, but not encouraged, right, in my work. But if somebody either, their well-being, their health, their safety is at risk, there might be some truths or maybe some patterns of behavior that I've observed, but when to share that, how to go about framing that. I mean, this is something I'm infinitely interested is you can communicate something, but how you go about doing that and how skillful you are at, first of all, just identifying your goals. Can you describe the situation? How do you express your emotions? Are you actually asking for something or saying no clearly? Can you adopt the other person's perspective about how that might impact them? And so, super complicated. But so I guess that's what's coming up for me is, oh, there are times where maybe I would be very cautious to be intellectually transparent because that actually might be damaging for a person if, let's say, their safety or well-being or somebody else's safety is at risk.
Sure. Yes, I think that's right.
Mm-hmm.
So the way that I've defined the trait, it's focused on improving the other person's understanding, and that sounds good. But
Right.
sometimes there's something more important to do than to improve their understanding. And if you're too focused on helping them understand something better, you may uh, be taking away from your ability to focus on something more important. So I guess what I would say about that is it's where sort of you need it's just one virtue.
Right.
We need
Right.
others to do all the work that we need to do.
And I mean, being really new to the whole thing about, virtue ethics and all that, and I mean, meeting Christian, reading more about, Emma and Taya and all those folks, is it common for, I know people tend to have their own area of expertise, which is common across the board, but this more big picture about there are so many of these virtues, how they interact, how to go about, I don't know if it's, practices for this, but just is it acknowledged and discussed a lot about just the complexities here and weighing one above the other? Yeah, I don't know. Just your thoughts on how common and nuanced this stuff is,
Yeah. I mean, there is. I think you can find reflected in contemporary philosophy, at least, sort of a bit of a concern about the seemingly infinite proliferation of the virtues.
Mm.
Like, well, it just seems like we get new ones all the time, and I'm partly to I'm
You're
to
introducing a
blame
new
a
one,
bit
Ryan.
here. Like
Yeah.
I'm one of the people doing this, so like coming up with new traits, hopefully with some justification. But
Mm-hmm.
no, there is a legitimate question to ask. Well, and we do ask this question. So if I give a talk about intellectual transparency, I have people say, well, isn't this just sort of honesty, or isn't it honesty plus some other thing like love of learning? Does it sort of reduce to some other traits, or is it really distinctive? Those are good questions. We need to,
Mm.
it's important for us to attend to those questions. You might think there are theoretical problems if really are infinitely many virtues and no like structure to them. So one theoretical problem that's raised about this is that if there really were infinitely many and there weren't any kind of structuring to them, then what would it mean to talk about the overall virtuous person? At least for some theories, you need to be able to talk about the overall virtuous person and what they would do. But you might not be able to make sense of that without either some kind of, you know, structuring to the virtues, saying that some are kind of cardinal,
Mm-hmm.
they're sort of central, and others sort of more specialized versions of those central virtues. So yeah, I think those are very good questions. They're important to continue investigating. I have done some thinking about like trying to understand where intellectual transparency sort of fits within some structuring
Yeah.
of virtues. I think it's not going to be like, if you have a small list, like a handful of most cardinal virtues, I don't think it would be on that list. I think it would be sort of more specialized.
Mm-hmm.
At the time I was writing the book on intellectual dependability, there was really only one article out there from quite a while ago, uh, the early 2000s, that was sort of saying, "Hey, what about other regarding intellectual virtues? What about intellectual virtues that are involved in helping other people gain knowledge and understanding, rather than so much focused on helping the uh, person themselves to gain those?" And so I hope that something that comes out of this work is just kind of a turning of attention to that topic, and
Mm.
and um, turning of interdisciplinary attention to that topic. That this is quite important. We really do need people who are intellectually dependable. The kind of world that we live in, we need to be able to rely on others to help us think things through. And if we can get some better academic thinking about what that involves, and can take further steps, ones that I said that we haven't been able to take, at least I haven't been able to take, in terms of figuring out what really helps people to grow in these things, to get better at these things. I think that would be all to the good, and it would have potentially significant impacts for relationships and work and so on.
Yeah, absolutely. Well, are there aspects to your work and your interest here that I know we haven't really touched on, like civic engagement, right? How this impacts our politics, and we'll be limited in what we can cover today. But are there key things that really are interesting to you that we haven't really dove into here that you want to make sure that we take some time to talk about?
Yes, I'm grateful that we were able to talk both about intellectual transparency and personal relationships, and a bit about work as well. I am doing some sort of follow-up work on intellectual transparency in the workplace. Same kind of study design as the one I mentioned about personal relationships, but in this case, sort of employee and supervisor relationships. So looking to see whether the employees being more intellectually transparent at work, is that at all predictive of the supervisor and how they rate the employees' performance? They view them as performing better at work. So that's a topic that hopefully will have some more interesting results to look at sometime soon. Civic engagement, yeah. So that was actually more the focus of the work that Megan Haggard and I were doing, as we were looking at whether these other regarding virtues might make a difference for civic engagement, whether people would be, volunteer more in their community, whether they would participate more in democratic processes. And we did find some relationships there, but we're relying just on sort of self-reports and whether people say that they're acting as a mentor or a coach and these kinds of things, or whether they how frequently they sign petitions. So that kind of work, or encourage people to vote. So I think there's a lot of room for further investigation of that kind of topic, but it does seem like an area where these kinds of traits may be relevant, might make a difference beyond sort of individual relationships, but might make a difference for communities.
Well, I'm incredibly grateful to you for taking the time. Again, meeting you was awesome, and I'm really happy that we could find a time to chat here today. And so for listeners who are really interested and might want to know more about you, is there a place you would direct them that they can either get in touch with you or find out more about you?
Sure, it's not too hard if you just Google T. Ryan Byerly. First couple of hits will be either my page for the University of Sheffield or my personal website, which is tryanbyerly.weebly.com. And you can find information in both of those places about my published work and how to contact me. I'm always happy to hear from folks.
Cool. Well, again, Ryan, thank you so much for taking the time to chat. And yeah, let's maybe just plan on keeping in touch down the road, and I'll look forward to, all the progress on all the great work you're doing.
Great. Thank you so much. Thanks so much for having me on.